One person, one vote, one value. It's the fundamental idea,
That
right?
is the bedrock principle.
But when you really start looking at how our electoral maps are drawn, you have to wonder, well, if that principle actually holds up in practice.
Hmm.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling exactly that question by looking into the real intricacies of delimitation in India.
Right. And at its heart, delimitation is, the process of defining or redrawing the boundaries, the lines on the map for electoral constituencies.
For places like the Lok Sabha state assemblies.
Exactly. The core goal is to get a reasonable balance between the population size of an area and how many representatives it gets. Parity, basically.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some, dry legal thing. It has a real impact on you, the listener.
Oh, definitely.
It shapes how fairly your voice is actually heard in our political system. And ultimately, it plays a big role in who holds power.
A very big role.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the mechanics, how these lines get drawn, why it's often so controversial, and what the future might hold.
Yeah, and we've been digging through quite a bit, academic articles, government reports, news analysis.
Trying to get a full picture.
Exactly. To really understand the complexities, the implications of delimitation, especially, as our population changes and the whole conversation around fair representation evolves.
So let's start there. Defining delimitation a bit more. You said it sets the boundaries.
It establishes the basic units, yeah.
Yeah.
The geographical and population units that underpin our whole system of political representation. Think of it like setting the stage before every single election.
Okay, setting the stage. But what makes it such a politically charged issue? It could sound like just, well, map drawing.
But it's much more than that. It's significant because the way these districts are drawn can seriously affect the fortunes of different political parties.
How so?
Well, the lines can inadvertently or sometimes intentionally create advantages for some groups, some parties, and disadvantages for others. And beyond just party politics, it fundamentally shapes the relationship between democracy, the idea of representation, and the actual territory.
So getting it right means each vote carries roughly the same weight.
That's the ideal, yes, no matter where you cast it.
It's interesting, though. Our sources point out that different countries handle this very differently. India relies on ordinary law, Article 327.
Yes, which some experts like Ivor Jennings back in the day found quite surprising.
Surprising. Why?
Well, his view was that setting constituency boundaries is so fundamental, it really should be a core constitutional matter, not just left to ordinary legislation. Places like Ceylon, as it was, New Zealand, South Africa, they have much more detailed constitutional rules for this.
Right. And I suppose trying to do this in India, given the sheer size and diversity, it must be incredibly tricky.
Oh, absolutely. It's what you might call a democratic paradox for large republics. You're constantly trying to balance these competing factors.
Like what?
Like maintaining geographical coherence, making sure constituency populations are roughly equal, thinking about representation for different communities, administrative boundaries, and then inevitably there are political considerations too.
And the official criteria reflect that mix.
They do. Things like population parity, yes, but also respecting administrative units, keeping districts together, for example. Then there's local community interests, physical features, mountains, rivers, even how easy it is to travel within a constituency.
So it boils down to a fundamental question then, doesn't it?
What's that?
What's the main priority? Is it pure numerical equality, every vote counting exactly the same number-wise? Or is it more about administrative convenience and this broader idea of balanced representation, factoring in geography and communities?
That's precisely the tension. It's the core trade-off. The principle of one person, one vote, one value based strictly on numbers versus the practicalities and, frankly, the politics of getting fair representation across such a diverse country.
Achieving both perfectly seems unlikely.
It's an ongoing challenge, definitely, especially in a place as complex as India.
Okay, let's shift to the history a bit. India did have delimitation exercises early on, didn't it? After independence.
Yes, there were exercises in 1952, 1962, and again, based on the 1971 census, the orders came out around 1973, but based on the 71 data.
But then suddenly a halt in 1976. What happened?
That was the 42nd Amendment during the emergency.
Mm.
It effectively froze delimitation, pushing it off until after the 2001 census results were out.
And the main reason?
The primary driver was concerns from the southern states. They'd been, relatively speaking, more successful with population control compared to many northern states.
Right.
And they worried they'd be politically penalized, that they'd lose parliamentary seats because their population hadn't grown as fast.
So punished for progress in a way.
That was certainly the perception, that states with higher population growth, mainly in the north, would gain more political clout at their expense.
Was it just about population numbers and seats?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
There was a significant economic angle, too. The southern states, generally wealthier, were contributing a larger chunk of central revenue. But central funds were often redistributed based on need, which tended to benefit the poorer northern states, which also had higher fertility rates. So yes, money, economic factors, maybe even more than just population counts, played a big part in kicking the can down the road on delimitation.
And this freeze didn't just end after 2001, did it? It got extended.
It did. The 84th Amendment in 2001 extended the freeze on the total number of Lok Sabha seats for each state until after the first census following 2026.
So the overall pie size for each state was fixed.
Exactly. And then the 91st Amendment bill, also around 2001-2003, effectively deferred the actual redrawing of boundaries within states, the main delimitation exercise, until after 2026 as well. Though there was a delimitation based on the 2001 census for internal adjustments, the statewide allocation remained frozen based on 1971 figures.
Okay, so this long historical freeze really sets the stage for this north-south dynamic that keeps coming up. What are the core worries now as we approach that post-2026 period?
Well, the argument, as our sources really stress, is that redrawing these lines isn't just a technical tweak, it's fundamental. It's rethinking representation itself.
How so?
You have classic democratic theory, people like James Madison, suggesting bigger republics might struggle with maintaining true democratic connection. But then there's the counter idea. Maybe larger populations actually boost democracy, more diversity, more challengers.
Interesting theories. But focusing on the north-south split, what are the specific fears from the south?
The big one is losing parliamentary seats, a significant number, because their population growth has been lower than in many northern states.
Are there projections for this?
Yes, a video report analysis, which our sources cite, paints a pretty stark picture. If you use projected 2026 population figures,
Okay.
Tamil Nadu, Kerala, the former undivided Andhra Pradesh, they could each potentially lose something like 8 Lok Sabha seats.
8 seats each. That's huge.
It is. And conversely, states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar could gain significantly, maybe 11 and 10 seats respectively.
Wow. That would be a major shift in the political balance of power nationally.
Absolutely. And the fear in the South is that this leads to what some call political centralization, where the power and influence of these slower-growing states get diminished.
And the economic disparity feeds into this anxiety.
Definitely. You have the southern states contributing, over 31% of India's GDP, with only about 21% of the population. So there's this feeling that their economic contribution isn't matched by political weight, and that weight could shrink further.
Our sources mention this 3-3-3 puzzle. What's that about? And this idea of the South subsidizing the North.
Right. The 3-3-3 puzzle refers to this observation of a widening income gap between the richest 3 states and the poorest 3 states in India over time. And this economic reality fuels a political narrative, an analogy used by some commentators, suggesting that the South, with generally higher incomes, better infrastructure, health, education metrics, is, in effect, subsidizing the North, which faces challenges like higher population growth, unemployment, and greater social development needs. The data does show these divergences in GDP per capita, manufacturing, poverty rates, and so on.
It's clearly a very sensitive point, this whole north-south dimension. But what's the counterargument? Isn't redrawing boundaries based on population just following the constitutional principle?
That's the other side, yes.
No.
The argument is that an impartial Delimitation Commission is meant to do exactly that, ensure fair representation based on where people actually live now, reflecting the changing demographics, as the Constitution requires. The principle is representation based on population.
Which brings us neatly to the Delimitation Commission itself. It's meant to be independent, nonpartisan.
Correct. It's set up as an independent body, separate from the Election Commission.
Yeah.
And crucially, its decisions on redrawing boundaries are legally final. You can't challenge them in court.
Really? Not challengeable.
Not the final order, no. Article 82 makes that clear, and the Supreme Court recently reinforced this when it dismissed a challenge to the Jammu and Kashmir delimitation.
So its main job is to look at the census data and redraw the lines accordingly.
Essentially, yes. To understand and capture the changing demographics based on the latest census. But the big challenge, as we discussed, is balancing that one person, one vote, one value idea with the sheer complexity of India, the diverse population, the geography.
And it hasn't always been straightforward, even for the commission. You mentioned delays in the Northeast earlier.
That's right. Delimitation was put on hold in Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Nagaland for decades since the 1970s. It points to long-standing issues, often linked to specific social situations or security concerns in those regions.
And the recent exercises in Assam and J&K, they weren't without controversy either.
No, they serve as really good recent examples of the challenges. Criticisms often arise, sometimes perceptions that politics played a role, especially when delimitation happens in areas with recent conflict or significant social shifts.
Let's dive into those cases then. Assam first. Delimitation there wrapped up relatively recently in 2023.
Yes, it resumed based on the 2002 Delimitation Act, but using the 2001 census data, strangely enough, it finally concluded in 2023.
And what did they consider? What changed?
Well, the commission said it engaged with lots of stakeholders. They looked at geography, population density, communications, trying to keep administrative units intact.
Did the number of seats change?
No, the total number of assembly seats stayed 126 and Lok Sabha at 14. But some constituency names changed. The significant change was in reserve seats.
Ah, for SCs and STs.
Exactly. Reserve seats for stage tribes went up from 16 to 19 in the assembly, and they got 2 reserved Lok Sabha seats. And for scheduled castes, it went from 8 to 9 assembly seats and 1 Lok Sabha seat.
Our sources gave some examples of constituency profiles in Assam, Kokrachhar, Dhubri. What do they tell us?
They really highlight the diversity. Kokrachhar, for instance, is an ST reserve seat with a high tribal population, but actually a smaller overall population than the state average.
Okay.
Whereas Dhubri is one of the most populous constituencies, huge numbers, but a lower percentage of SC/ST population.
Yeah.
So it shows the balancing act population size versus ensuring representation for specific groups across very different areas. Dhubri has massive electoral weight, just based on numbers.
And the reactions in Assam, you said, were mixed.
Very mixed. Some saw it as politically motivated, especially with the whole NRC process hanging in the background. Concerns were definitely raised about how it might impact future election results.
But others saw it differently.
Others welcomed it as, a necessary step, long overdue, to align representation with the demographic reality, even if based on the 2001 census, a step towards democratic process.
Okay, now let's look at Jammu and Kashmir. That was also quite recent and had its own unique context.
It's very unique. The commission was set up in 2020 after the J&K Reorganization Act of 2019, and it used the 2011 census data.
What was different about the J&K approach?
One key thing was categorizing districts by terrain hilly, mixed, flat. This allowed for a bit more flexibility, a deviation in population size when drawing constituency lines, acknowledging the geography.
And reservations.
That was a major development. For the first time, 9 assembly seats were reserved for scheduled tribes and 7 for scheduled castes.
Was there public consultation?
Yes, the commission engaged with political parties, the public. There were demands, for instance, for reserved seats specifically for Kashmiri migrants and also for people displaced from Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, POJK.
And the geography itself must have been a huge challenge.
Absolutely. Tough terrain, extreme weather, security issues along the border, all major logistical hurdles. Our sources talk about the diverse living conditions and just the competing claims for fair representation from different communities.
The source also broke down the parliamentary constituencies, Baramulla, Srinagar, etc. What did that show?
It showed quite a varied picture across the 5 seats. Baramulla, for example, has a significant ST population, but hardly any SCs. Jammu has the highest SC proportion. Enact Nagrajuri is notable for its large ST population. It just underscores the demographic complexity the commission had to deal with.
And what about those specific proposals for Kashmiri migrants and POJK displaced persons? Were they controversial?
They were. The commission proposed reserving at least 2 assembly seats for Kashmiri migrants, giving them powers similar to nominated members elsewhere. There were calls for POJK reservations too, but this definitely sparked controversy.
Why?
Some political parties, particularly opposition groups, raised concerns that these moves and also the way constituencies like Anantnag and Baramulla were restructured were designed to benefit the ruling party, the BJP, by changing the demographic influence and political dynamics.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about women's reservation. A huge bill passed, the Nari Shakti Vandana Adhiniyam, but its implementation seems tied up with delimitation.
That's a critical link, yes. The Act mandates reserving 1/3 of seats in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies for women. a landmark move.
Ah.
But the Act states this reservation will only come into effect after the next delimitation exercise is completed,
And that delimitation can only happen.
after the first census conducted after the year 2026.
So it's a sequence. Wait for the census post-2026. Conduct that census, publish the figures, then do the delimitations based on those figures, and only then does women's reservation kick in.
Precisely. And furthermore, the rotation of which seats are reserved for women will also happen only after each subsequent delimitation.
So this linkage definitely delays things. We're probably looking at 2029 at the earliest, maybe later.
That seems the most likely scenario, yes. The 2029 general election, or potentially even later, depending on the census and delimitation timelines.
And does a similar dependency exist for SC and ST reservations? Are they also tied to population updates via delimitation?
Yes, absolutely. Article 332 links SCST reserved seats directly to their population proportion within each state.
So a new census and delimitation will recalculate the number of seats reserved for them too.
Correct, based on the latest population figures for SCs and STs in each state, which means delays in delimitation directly impact ensuring their representation keeps pace with demographic shifts. It hinders, you could argue, their adequate political presence and socioeconomic progress.
Okay, so looking ahead now, what's the future hold for delimitation in India? What are the main arguments and potential paths forward?
Well, as we've sort of touched upon, the two big arguments against purely population-based delimitation are, one, it penalizes states that did well on family planning, and two, it could really upset the federal balance of power.
So what's the alternative thinking?
Many argue it needs to be guided by broader ideas of equity and justice, using unbiased procedures. One concrete proposal that's floated is maybe increasing the total number of Lok Sabha seats.
Increase the size of parliament. How would that help?
The idea is to increase it enough so that no state actually loses the number of seats it currently has. The additional seats would then be distributed based on population share from the new census.
So nobody loses out, but growing states still gain representation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's seen as a way to potentially mitigate the political opposition from states set to lose seats under the current system. And it could also help with another issue.
Which is?
The sheer size of our constituencies. They're massive compared to many other democracies. The average MP represents a huge number of people.
Right, making it hard for MPs to be responsive.
That's the argument. Expanding the Lok Sabha could lead to smaller, more manageable constituencies, potentially improving that connection between MPs and the people they represent.
But that would require constitutional changes, wouldn't it? It sounds complex.
Oh, extremely complex. You're talking about navigating delimitation, constitutional amendments, legal hurdles, all while dealing with this very sensitive issue of uneven population growth across states.
Is there any other out-of-the-box thinking mentioned?
Well, separate from Lok Sabha delimitation, but related to representation, some sources briefly mention the rather radical idea of maybe considering direct elections for the Rajya Sabha, like the U.S. Senate after their 17th Amendment.
Right.
But that's a whole different kettle of fish.
Definitely a separate deep dive. So, wrapping this up, the bottom line seems to be we urgently need a census, and then the delimitation that follows. It's critical for balancing power in the Lok Sabha, ensuring fair representation for women, SCs, STs.
Absolutely critical.
But the how is still very much up for debate, trying to balance population principles with federal stability and fairness concerns.
Precisely. That next delimitation, whenever it happens after the census, will be a truly pivotal moment for Indian democracy. It's not just about drawing lines on a map. It impacts representation for key groups and the fundamental relationship between the states and the center.
So it leaves us, and you, the listener, with a big question to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, the census delays, delimitation complexities, the link to women's reservation, the north-south anxieties, what do you think is the most equitable and politically realistic path forward? How do we ensure fair and effective representation for everyone in India's incredibly diverse democracy?
Yeah, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lots to think about.